There was a glass of water on the table that nobody touched. It sat at the empty place near the far end, beside a leather folio and a fountain pen, worth more than the woman pouring the coffee earned in a month. 41 floors below, the city had gone to amber. Up here, in the private dining room the hotel called the Lantern Suite, 11 people in dark suits were about to sign their names to something that took 2 years and 1,000 expensive lawyers to build. $1,200,000,000. A merger, 2 shipping companies becoming one, and a press release already written, already loaded, already waiting for a single click at 9 o'clock. Delphine moved along the wall with the silver coffee service and made herself the kind of small that a room like this teaches you to be. She refilled the cups. She did not look at faces. She had learned a long time ago that the safest thing in a room of important men is to be furniture, and she had been good furniture for 9 years. Then she set the pot down on the sideboard, and she stopped. She had heard a name. Just a name spoken by the man at the head of the table as he tapped a page in the folio in front of him. A vessel, a registry number, a certificate of origin for a fleet of cargo ships that was, the man said, the cleanest in the industry. He said it the way men say things they have decided are true. And Delphine, who was supposed to be furniture, knew that it was a lie, not a guess, not a feeling. She knew the way you know your own mother's handwriting, because she had held the real version of that certificate in her own 2 hands in another country, in another life, and the real version did not say what this man's folio said. She picked the coffee pot back up. Her hands were steady. That part surprised her later, when she had time to be surprised by anything. Her hands did not shake at all. What she did next took 9 minutes, and when it was over, the billion-dollar merger was dead on the table. And not one of the 11 people in that room would ever forget the housekeeper who killed it. You have to understand who she was before that night, though, or none of it will mean what it should. Let me take you back. Delphine Asante was born in a port city on the other side of an ocean, in a narrow house that smelled of diesel and salt and her father's pipe tobacco. Her father was a customs broker. That is a small, unglamorous job, and most people never think about it once in their lives. But every single thing you own, the shoes on your feet, and the screen you are looking at, and the coffee in your cup, crossed a border somewhere, and somebody had to read the papers that let it cross. Her father read those papers. He read them better than anyone on that whole stretch of coast. He had a leather notebook, soft and dark and worn at the corners, and in it he kept the things the official forms never taught. Which shipping line lied about its tonnage, which certificate of origin used a stamp that a certain office had stopped issuing in a certain year. How to tell a forged bill of lading from a real one. By the way the carbon bled through the 3rd page. He wrote it all in a small slanting hand in 2 languages, switching between them in the middle of a sentence the way the city itself did. Delphine sat beside him at the kitchen table from the time she was 7, and he taught her the way some fathers teach a child to fish. Not all at once, a little at a time over years, until it was simply part of how she saw the world. He used to tell her one thing over and over until it lived in her bones. Paper remembers, he said. People forget and people lie, and people pay other people to forget and to lie. The paper, though, remembers what really happened if you know how to read it. She believed him. She built her whole young life on it. By the time she was 19, she was working in the customs house herself, sitting at a wooden desk with a green lamp, checking the documents of ships that came in from 40 countries. She was fast, and she was quiet, and she was almost never wrong. The older men learned to bring the difficult files to her, the ones that did not sit right, and she would turn them over in the light and find the small, wrong thing that everyone else had missed. For 6 years that was her life, and she loved it. She remembered one file in particular, the way you remember a teacher who changed you. A grain freighter had come in from the south with papers that were almost perfect. Almost. The older clerks had passed it twice. Delphine kept it on her desk for an afternoon, not because anything was visibly wrong, but because the weight of it felt wrong in her hands, and her father had taught her that the eye knows before the mind does. She found it at last in the dates. The certificate had been signed on a Sunday, and the office that signed it was closed on Sundays, had been closed on Sundays for 40 years. and the man who had forged it had been so careful about every figure that he had forgotten the one thing no forger thinks to check, which is the day of the week. She walked it to the chief clerk herself. She was 22. The grain freighter did not unload that week, and a man in a good coat who had expected it to unload was very angry, and her father, when she told him at the kitchen table that night, did not smile, because he never smiled at these things. He only nodded, slowly, and said, "The day of the week." Good. They always forget the small true thing. Remember that. They guard the big lie, and they leave the small true thing standing in the open. She remembered that. She would have cause to. Then the war came to her city the way wars come, with no warning anyone would admit later, and the customs house closed and the port closed, and the narrow house with the pipe tobacco smell was gone before her father could carry his notebook out of it. He carried it out anyway. He had it in his coat when they walked to the border, and he gave it to her on the last night they were together before the sickness took him in a camp on the far side of a river neither of them had ever wanted to cross. "Read it sometimes," he told her, "so you don't forget who taught you to see." She crossed the ocean alone. She was 26, and here is the thing about crossing an ocean. The skills do not cross with you. Not the way you think they will. 6 years of expert work, a customs officer's entire eye, a fluency in the secret language of trade documents, and none of it appeared on any form that any office on this side of the water knew how to read. Her credentials were ash in a building that no longer stood. Her experience was in a country that, for the purposes of the people who hire and fire, might as well have been a rumor. So she cleaned. She started in a laundry, then a nursing home, then, 9 years ago, the hotel. The Cendrillon, 43 floors of marble and brushed brass on the best avenue in the city, where the housekeeping staff wore laundered grey and moved through the halls like a tide that came in every morning and went out every night, unseen. She was good at it, she was good at everything she did. Because her father had not taught her to be a customs officer. He had taught her to pay attention, and paying attention is the same skill, whether you are reading a bill of lading or folding the corner of a bedsheet so it lies flat as glass. She did not stop reading the paper, though. That is the part that people who underestimated her never understood. In the small room she rented, she kept up. She read the shipping news. She read the trade journals that the business guests left behind in their suites, the ones she was supposed to throw away, and she did throw them away, but only after she had read them in her break, sitting on an upturned bucket in a storeroom with her father's notebook open on her knee. She knew which lines were buying which lines. She knew the names of the big vessels and the games the big companies played. She kept her father's eye sharp on a world that no longer paid her to look. A skill is heavier than a house, and it weighs nothing at all. The border guard could search her bag and find only clothes. The office that lost her file could lose it 100 times over. The war could burn the building and the desk and the green lamp and the whole coast, and it had, and still it could not reach inside her head and unteach her what her father had spent 18 years teaching. That stayed. That was the one piece of luggage that crossed the ocean intact. And she carried it through 9 years of folded sheets and emptied bins, sharpening it on trade journals in a storeroom, waiting, though she did not know she was waiting, for a night she could not have imagined. Her closest friend at the hotel was an older woman named Lottie Boateng, who had cleaned the banquet floors for 22 years and knew where every secret in the building was buried. Lottie was broad and slow-moving and had a laugh like a warm kitchen, and she took one look at Delphine on her first day and decided to look after her, and never stopped. They ate their lunches together in the storeroom off the banquet kitchen, the two of them on upturned buckets with the noise of the floor coming muffled through the door. Lottie talked and Delphine listened, which suited them both. Lottie had buried her husband and raised 4 children on the wage the Cendrillon paid, and she had no illusions left about what the people on the top floor thought of the people who cleaned for them, and she had decided long ago that the only freedom in the work was to do it so well that nobody could touch you, and to keep your own counsel, and to look after your own. She saw the notebook the first week. She did not ask about it. A year later, when Delphine finally told her what it was and what was in it. and what her hands had once done for a living. Lottie listened to the whole thing without a word, and at the end she put her broad hand flat on the table and said only, "Well, so you are not what they think you are either." And then she laughed her warm kitchen laugh because she said, "None of us ever are, child, not one of us, and that is the joke they will never get to be in on." It was Lottie who taught her the banquet rooms, how to pour without a sound, how to vanish against a wall, how to read a high room by its shoulders, who was nervous, who was lying, who was about to lose. And it was Lottie who, on a grey Tuesday last spring, came to her with a problem that put Delphine in the Lantern Suite on the night everything changed. The hotel had a contract, an enormous one, with a shipping firm called Meridian Atlantic. Whenever Meridian's people came to the city, they took the whole top floor, and they were particular, and the management lived in terror of them. Meridian was the smaller of the two companies in the merger, the one being bought, and the buyer, the one writing the $1.2 billion check, was a firm called Calderstone Holdings, run by a man named Garrett Vance. Lottie's problem was simple. Two of the banquet staff had quit, and the signing dinner for the Calderstone and Meridian merger was in 3 days, and the head of housekeeping needed someone steady, someone invisible, someone who would not drop a fork in front of a billionaire. She needed Delphine. So that is how a woman who had once caught forged certificates for a living came to be standing against the wall of a private dining room holding a silver coffee pot on the night two shipping empires tried to become one. Let me paint the full picture for you so you feel the size of the thing. Garrett Vance sat at the head of the table. He was a tall man in his middle 50s in a charcoal suit, so well cut it looked grown rather than sewn, with silver hair and the easy, dismissive confidence of a man who had never in his adult life been the least important person in any room. He had built Calderstone out of nothing. The magazines liked to say, or the people who actually knew, said he had built it out of other people's nothing, swallowing smaller firms whole and keeping only the parts he liked. Meridian Atlantic was to be his largest meal yet. After tonight, Calderstone would control one of the biggest cargo fleets on the Atlantic, and Garrett Vance would be exactly as large as he had always told himself he was. Across from him sat the people from Meridian, and at the center of them, small and silver-haired and straight-backed, sat the woman who had built Meridian and was about to sell it. Inez Vermeer, the chairwoman, 70 years old, with eyes that missed nothing and a stillness that the younger people in the room mistook for age. Between the two of them, on the table, sat the merger. Folios, a signing pen, a laptop, closed, with the press release inside it, and the document that Garrett Vance kept tapping with 2 fingers, the one he called the cleanest in the industry. It was a due diligence summary of Meridian's fleet, and inside it was a certificate of origin and seaworthiness for Meridian's flagship class of vessels, the 4 largest ships in the deal, the ships that were worth nearly a third of the entire purchase price. The certificate said those 4 ships were registered, inspected, and clear, built in a particular yard in a particular year, with a particular hull classification that made them worth what Calderstone was paying. Delphine had processed the real certificate for one of those exact ships 11 years ago in a customs house that no longer existed, on a coast that no longer let ships in. She remembered it because it had been a difficult file, one of the ones the older men brought to her desk, and she had spent 2 days on it. And at the end of those 2 days, she had found that the whole classification had been quietly changed by someone who stood to make a great deal of money from the change. The ship in the folio, in front of Garrett Vance, was not the ship that the certificate described. She knew it, the way she knew her own name. She was furniture, though, and furniture does not speak. So she stood against the wall and she listened, and what she heard over the next half hour turned the steadiness in her hands into something else, because Garrett Vance was not careless. That is the thing you must understand about him, or the night makes no sense. A careless man you can forgive. Garrett Vance had known. Somewhere in the long machinery of the deal, the truth about those 4 ships had surfaced, the way truth does, and instead of stopping, he had buried it. Delphine heard him bury it again, right there at the table, in a voice as smooth as the marble in the lobby. One of his own people, a younger lawyer with a nervous mouth, raised a small question about the flagship vessels. Just a question. A flag on a line. And Garrett Vance turned to him with a smile that did not reach anywhere near his eyes and said that the matter had been reviewed and resolved and was not to be raised again at this table or any other, and that anyone who could not understand that should consider whether they understood their own future. The young lawyer looked down at his hands and said nothing more. There was a small movement around the table. After that, a settling, the way a flock settles. When the hawk has passed, everyone had understood the lesson. You did not ask about the flagship vessels. You did not ask about the 4 ships that were worth a third of the price. Some doors in this deal were closed, and the men who opened them did not come back. Delphine watched the young lawyer's hands. They had gone still on the leather of the folio too, still the stillness of a person making himself not exist, and she knew that stillness from the inside, because it was her own, because it was the stillness she put on every morning when she clocked in. She felt something for him then that surprised her. He was on the other side of every line that divided that room, and he was wearing a suit that cost more than her month, and he was learning the same thing she had learned, that there are rooms where the safest thing is to disappear, and that the price of staying safe is that you put your name to whatever the room decides. And Inez Vermeer, across the table, watched Garrett Vance the way a chess player watches an opponent reach for the wrong piece. She did not say anything either. She was 70 years old and she had built an empire, and she had not done it by speaking first. Delphine refilled the coffee. She was thinking about her father. Paper remembers, he had said, and the paper in that folio remembered a crime. 4 ships sold as something they were not, for a price built on a lie, and a man at the head of the table who had decided to make 11 people and $1 billion complicit in it, whether they knew or not. The young lawyer with a nervous mouth would sign tonight and spend the next 10 years not knowing he had put his name to a fraud. Inez Vermeer would sell, and the lie would become hers too, attached to her life's work like a stain she could never explain. And the people who would pay in the end were never the people at the table. They never were. They were the crews who would sail those 4 wrongly classified ships through Atlantic winters they were not built to survive. That was what a wrong hull classification meant. It was not an accounting trick. It was a question of whether steel could take the sea. Delphine put the coffee pot down on the sideboard. Her father's notebook was in the deep pocket of her grey uniform, where it had been every working day for 9 years, because she could not make herself leave it at home. She put her hand on it through the cloth. She thought about staying furniture. She wants you to know she thought about it. She had a son in his 2nd year of college, and a rent that went up every spring, and a job she could not afford to lose. In a building where a housekeeper who spoke out of turn to a billionaire would be gone by morning with no reference and no recourse, and no one to ask why. She thought about all of it. She thought about her son's tuition and the way he had laughed on the phone 3 nights ago about a class he loved, and how that laugh was built on this job, on this wage, on her staying invisible, in rooms exactly like this one. She thought about Lottie, who would be questioned too, who had vouched for her, who could lose 22 years over a younger woman's outburst. She thought about how easy it would be to pick the coffee pot back up and refill the cups and let the click come at 9 o'clock and walk out into the night, having seen nothing, knowing nothing, being nothing, which was the safest thing of all. And then she thought about 4 ships in a winter sea, and crews who would never know her name, and a man who had decided that their lives were a line item he could bury, and she understood that there are some things you cannot fold flat and tuck into a corner, no matter how good you are at making yourself small. She thought about her father in his coat at the border, with the notebook held against his chest, choosing to carry the one thing that had no resale value at all, the one thing that was only worth what it taught, and she understood for the first time, standing against that wall, why he had carried it. He had not carried it for her. He had carried it because a man who has spent his life learning to see cannot make himself stop seeing, and a person who cannot stop seeing has a duty that comes attached to the sight, whether they want it or not. The seeing is not free. It was never free. That was the thing he had never said, the thing the notebook said for him, on every page, in 2 languages. If you can read the lie, you are no longer allowed to pretend you cannot. A clock somewhere chimed the quarter hour. It was 9:15. The press release was set for 9. She had 15 minutes. She did not have a plan. That is the part that frightened her most, later. She had no document in her hand, no proof she could lay on the table, nothing but a memory from 11 years ago and a notebook full of her father's slanting writing. Everything she knew lived inside her head in a language this room had decided she did not speak. She knew one thing about rooms like this, though, a thing Lottie had taught her without meaning to. A room like this runs on the certainty that the people serving it cannot possibly know anything worth hearing. That certainty is the wall, and a wall, if you push it in exactly the right place, is also a door. She set down the silver tray. She straightened her grey uniform, and she stepped forward into the light at the centre of the room where no housekeeper had any business being, and she spoke. "Forgive me," she said. Her voice was quiet, and it did not shake. "Before you sign, there is something about the 4 flagship vessels that you need to know." For a moment, nobody moved. 11 faces turned toward her with the blank surprise of people watching a chair begin to talk. The head of housekeeping, standing by the service door, went the colour of the marble. Lottie, beside her, drew a single sharp breath and held it. Garrett Vance recovered first. He was good at recovering. He gave her a smile of vast and gentle patience, the smile of a man being kind to an animal, and he said, "I think you've wandered into the wrong room. Someone will see you out." He did not raise his voice. He did not have to. He simply turned his attention back to the folio as though she had already stopped existing, which, in the only world he had ever lived in, she had. Delphine did not move toward the door. "The certificate of origin in that folder," she said, "for the 4 flagship vessels. The hull classification on it is wrong. I know it is wrong because I processed the real certificate for one of those ships 11 years ago at the customs house in the port where it was built. Before the war closed it, the classification was changed. I caught it then. It is the same change. It is in front of you." Now the room had gone very still. Garrett Vance set down his pen. The patience left his face, and what came into it instead was the thing Delphine had been waiting to see. The thing that told her she was right, because a man who is being accused of nothing does not look the way Garrett Vance looked. He looked at her the way you look at a fire you thought you had put out. "This is absurd," he said, and now his voice had an edge in it, fine and hard. "This woman is a member of the hotel staff. She has no knowledge of this transaction, no standing to comment on it, and frankly, no idea what those words even mean. Vessel classification is a technical matter handled by certified marine surveyors, not by, with respect, the catering." He turned to the man beside him. "Get her out! And I'll be speaking to the general manager about how a member of the kitchen staff came to be standing in a closed signing." The man rose. The head of housekeeping started forward, hands out, mouthing apologies. And here is where the room nearly closed the door again, because everything Garrett Vance had said was, in the eyes of that room, true. She was the catering. She had no standing, she had no proof but her own word, and her own word in a room like that weighed exactly nothing. She felt the certainty of 9 years pressing her back toward the wall. Be furniture, be small, be gone. Then Ines Vermeer spoke. The old woman had not moved the entire time. Now she lifted one hand, just slightly, off the table, and the man rising to remove Delphine stopped as though he had hit glass. Ines Vermeer had built Meridian Atlantic over 50 years, and there are some kinds of authority that do not need to be loud. "Let her finish," Ines said. Garrett Vance turned to her, incredulous. "Ines, you cannot seriously—" "I have spent 2 years," Ines said in her dry, unhurried voice, "and a great deal of money satisfying myself that everything in that folder is true. If a member of the hotel staff can stand in this room and tell me, in technical terms I myself can barely follow, that one of my own certificates is forged, then either she is mad, in which case it will take 2 minutes to prove it and we lose nothing, or she is right, in which case I would very much like to know it before I sign my name to it." She looked at Delphine, and something flickered in the old eyes that was almost a smile. Either way, let her finish. She did not give Delphine her argument. She did not save her. She only moved one hand and stopped a man and held the door open the width of a voice. The rest Delphine had to do herself. So she did. She did not raise her voice. She did not hurry. She spoke the way her father had taught her to read, one true thing at a time, in plain words, so that even the people in that room who had never seen a bill of lading could follow her down into the place where the lie was hidden. She told them what a whole classification was, not in jargon, in the only terms that mattered. She told them it was the mark that said how much sea a ship could take, what winters it could sail, what cargo it could carry, without the hull working itself apart in a storm. She told them that the 4 flagship vessels were classed in the folio 1 full grade higher than they had any right to be, and that the difference between those 2 grades was the difference between a ship that could cross the North Atlantic in February and a ship that could not. "Sir," Garrett Vance interrupted her twice. The first time, he said she was describing a vessel she could not possibly have seen. She answered that she had seen its certificate, and that a certificate is a vessel's truest face, and that she had read more vessels' faces than every certified surveyor in his employ combined in a customs house he had never heard of before he had ever bought his first ship. She said it without heat. It landed like a stone in still water. The second time, he interrupted, he changed his ground. He said the certificate was current, valid, issued by the proper authority, and that her so-called memory of some document from 11 years ago was worthless against an official seal. And that was his mistake. Because he had just told the room that the certificate was real, he had defended the paper, he had staked himself to it. And Delphine had spent her whole life learning that the safest way to catch a liar is to let him swear to the thing that is going to undo him. "You're right," she said. "There is an official seal on it. May I see it?" The room held its breath. Garrett Vance, trapped now by his own certainty, by the smile he had given her and the contempt he had spent, could not refuse without admitting he was afraid of what she would find. So he slid the folio down the length of the long table, past 10 sets of hands, until it stopped in front of the housekeeper in the laundered grey uniform. Delphine opened it. She took her father's notebook out of her pocket and laid it beside the folio, and she opened that too, to a page near the back, a page in his small slanting hand, in 2 languages. She turned the certificate to the light, the way she had turned 1,000 difficult files to the light at a wooden desk with a green lamp in a country that was gone. "The issuing authority on this seal," she said, "is the Maritime Registry of the port where these ships were built. I know that registry. My father did business with it for 30 years. She touched the page of the notebook. "Here is the stamp that registry used. And here is the year it changed. The registry replaced this exact seal 8 years ago, after a forgery scandal you can find in any trade journal if you look, which I imagine no one in this room thought to do because no one in this room ever expected to need to. The seal on your certificate is the old one. It is the one that stopped being issued 8 years ago. Which means this certificate, which claims to be current, was stamped with a seal that did not exist on the day it claims to have been signed." She closed the notebook. "Paper remembers," she said very quietly, to no one in the room, and to one man who was 9 years in the ground. Even when people would rather it didn't. It was 9 minutes from the moment she stepped forward to the moment she closed that notebook. Somebody counted it later and told her. 9 minutes. For a long time, nobody spoke at all. Then Inez Vermeer reached across the table and drew the folio back toward herself and looked down at the seal, at the small thing the housekeeper had pointed to, the thing 1,000 lawyers had walked past for 2 years. And the old woman's face changed in a way that told everyone in the room, without a single word, that she had just understood she had nearly signed her name to a fraud, and that the only reason she had not was a woman in a grey uniform that the buyer had called the catering. She did not look at Garrett Vance. She looked at the laptop, closed, with the press release inside it, set to go at 9. "Do not send that," she said to her own people. Her voice was flat and final. "Do not send anything tonight. As of this moment, this transaction is suspended, pending an independent verification of every certificate in that folder, beginning with these 4. Garrett Vance stood up. He tried. Even then, you have to give him that much. He was not a man who had ever lost, and he did not know how. He said it was a misunderstanding, a clerical error in the old certificate that had nothing to do with the ships themselves, that the deal was sound, that they could resolve it tonight and sign by morning. He said the word catering again, as though it could still save him, as though the wall he had leaned on his whole life was still standing. He spoke for a full minute, and every second of it dug him deeper, because everyone at that table had now seen what was on the seal, and a man explaining why the forgery in front of them did not matter is a man confessing in a language he thinks no one understands. Nesvamir let him finish. Then she said one sentence in her dry, unhurried voice, and it was the last thing anyone said in the lantern suite that night. "Mr. Vance," she said, "I have spent 50 years learning the difference between a person who makes mistakes and a person who buries them. Sit down. You are no longer welcome at this table, and after tonight you will find a great many tables closed to you." He did not sit down. He gathered his folio and his pen, worth more than a month of Delphine's wages, and he walked the length of the long room toward the door, past the housekeeper he had dismissed as a member of the kitchen staff, and he did not look at her because he could not. The merger did not die quietly after that. Mergers never do. There were lawyers, and there were filings, and there were stories in the trade journals Delphine had been reading on an upturned bucket for 9 years. The Independent Review found that the 4 flagship vessels were exactly what she had said they were, classed a full grade above their true worth, and that the forged seal was not the only one. There were 3 other certificates with the same dead stamp threaded through the deal in places only someone who had buried them would have known to put them. Garrett Vance had not made a clerical error. He had built a quiet machine of small forgeries, each one too technical for any single lawyer to question, designed to pass exactly the kind of review that 1,000 lawyers had given it, by people who had every reason to look and no idea what they were looking at. It collapsed, all of it. Calderstone Holdings did not survive the year. The certified marine surveyors who had signed off on the seals were called before a board and could not explain how they had missed what a housekeeper had caught in 9 minutes. And the honest answer, the one none of them would say, was that they had never been taught to look. And she had been taught to look by a man at a kitchen table who loved her. And that is a different kind of education than any of them had ever bought. None of that is the part of the story that matters, though. The part that matters happened 3 days after, when Inez Vermeer came back to the Centre Lyon Hotel alone and asked at the front desk for a member of the housekeeping staff by name. The front desk did not know what to do with that. Chairwomen of shipping empires do not come asking for housekeepers. They sent for the head of housekeeping, who came down pale and stammering, certain that something had gone wrong, and Inez Vermeer waited in the marble lobby with the brass sconces and the amber light coming through the tall windows, and when Delphine came down in her grey uniform, the old woman stood up to meet her. She stood up for the housekeeper. In the lobby, in front of everyone. "I came to thank you properly," Inez said, "and to apologize. I have run a company for 50 years on the principle that I hire the best eyes I can find and pay them what they are worth, and the best pair of eyes in that room 3 nights ago belonged to the person I was paying the least, and I did not know your name." She paused. "I would like to," Delphine told her, and then Inez Vermeer offered her a job, not a gesture, not a thank you envelope of money that would have insulted them both. A real position, the one Meridian had needed for years and never knew how to fill. A document and certificate verification post in the office that reviewed the company's own fleet, reporting to no one but the chairwoman herself. The work her father had taught her, the work the ocean had tried to take. Delphine did not say yes right away. She is not the kind of woman who says yes right away to anything. She asked one question first. She asked whether the crews of those 4 ships had been told, the ones who would have sailed them, and Inez Vermeer said yes. That was the first thing she had done before the lawyers, before any of it, and Delphine looked at her for a long moment, and then she said yes. She kept the uniform. People always ask about that. The ones who hear the story. She framed it and hung it in the small office that became hers, the laundered grey with the name badge still pinned to it, and when people asked why she would keep such a thing, she would say that the uniform was not the shame they thought it was. The uniform was the 9 years she spent reading the world for free on an upturned bucket with her father's notebook open on her knee, keeping an eye sharp that nobody would pay for, waiting for a night she did not know was coming. The uniform was where she learned that paying attention does not require permission, and that the most dangerous person in any room is very often the one that room has decided not to see. The notebook she kept on her desk, soft and dark and worn at the corners, written in 2 languages in a small slanting hand. She read it sometimes the way her father had asked her to, so she would not forget who taught her to see. And on the nights when the office was empty and the city had gone to amber outside the tall windows, she would open it to the page near the back, the page with the dead stamp and the year it changed, and she would run her thumb along his writing, and she would remember a narrow house that smelled of diesel and salt and pipe tobacco a long way away, a long time ago on a coast that no longer let the ships come in. Here is what I want you to carry out of this. There are people moving through your world right now that the world has decided not to see. The woman who folds your sheets, the man who empties your bins, the quiet one against the wall with the coffee pot, making herself small because a room taught her that small was safe. The world looks at the uniform and stops looking, and it tells itself a comfortable story that the person inside the uniform knows only the uniform's work, and it builds whole empires on the certainty that the people serving the table could not possibly know anything worth hearing. That certainty is the wall, and every so often, if you are paying attention, you get to watch it become a door. So the next time you are in a room, any room, and there is someone in it that everyone else has agreed not to see, I want you to do one small thing. I want you to wonder what they know. I want you to wonder where they learned it and what it cost them to keep it sharp through all the years nobody asked. Because the most expensive mistake that important people make, over and over, in marble rooms 41 floors above a city that has gone to amber, is not that they break the rules. It is that they decide in advance who is allowed to see. And sometimes the person they have decided cannot possibly see has been reading the truth her whole life, in 2 languages at a worn kitchen table, taught by a man who told her that the page keeps what people throw away, and waiting, without knowing she was waiting, for the quarter hour when it would finally be her turn to speak. If this story sat with you the way it sat with me, stay a moment in the quiet of it before you move on and carry the question with you into your own rooms. That is all the asking I will do. The rest, like everything that mattered to her, is yours.